Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Categorically Romance podcast. My name is Bree, and I am so excited for today's episode. I have author Virginia Kantra joining me. Virginia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Bree, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been writing since I was 11 and trying to bribe my younger cousins to go to bed. But my first novel was not published until I was 42. So a little late to be a early bloomer or a, top 30 under 30. But I have since published over 30 novels of romance and paranormal romance, romantic suspense, and women's fiction. So I'm delighted to be able to do what I love and get paid for it.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. That I just turned 37 in November, and I came to romance late as like reading the genre, but
Hmm.
I've been wanting to write for like really the past like 2 years, and I just am like, if you don't do it now, you're never going to do it. So when I hear the occasional like, yep, I didn't sell my first novel till I was in my 40s, I'm like, okay, girl, you have time. You can chill out.
You totally do. In fact, I tell the story. My husband, who is amazing, used to call me an artist in search of a medium.
Okay.
And so I had been writing young adult fantasy, and this is back in the days when I was writing on a typewriter and mailing my manuscripts to New York, and I had small children at home, and so I would, take 5 years to complete a manuscript, and then I would send them in, and I would get these long, encouraging 2-page, single-spaced rejection letters back. But finally, then again, my husband looked at me and said, as our youngest started off to kindergarten, "What are you going to do when you grow up, babe?"
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I love reading about relationships. And I had a neighbor who had a garage stuffed with romance novels. And I would run over and like grab a stack to read when I could. And so I thought, wow, this is really where my heart is. And so that's I started back in the day when I was writing for Harlequin, and did about
Yeah.
15 novels for them.
I saw you had some intimate moments.
Yes, indeed, because at that point, Nora Roberts, Suzanne Brockman, Barbara Samuel O'Neill, who was writing as Ruth Wind, Jane Ann Krentz, Jenny Cruzy was writing, category romance. And I was like, these are all stories and authors that I really admired about writing about women who were doing strong and interesting things. And so that was my target market. I'm writing women's fiction now because what I have to say has kind of expanded. And while I'm still really interested in writing about relationships, I want to sort of talk about all the relationships in a woman's life, and the woman's journey. So I would say that my canvas is a little larger now, but the heart of the story is still all about the people and the relationships for me.
When did you realize creatively that you wanted to, I don't want to say necessarily pivot, but make that shift into writing women's fiction? Like how did that come to you? Like, it's time to do something a little different.
Well, I had Carolina Dreaming, which was the last contemporary romance set on the Outer Banks that I wrote for Berkeley. Came out in 2017 and won a Rita. And that was kind of a top of the mountain moment for me.
Mhm.
But my children are now all adults. And I really was thinking about that broader canvas. And what I was finding was that while I still was really interested in the love and the relationship, I really wanted to tell fuller stories. And not that family wasn't always an important part, and not that a romance isn't a fully fleshed story, but I just was very conscious of the parts I was leaving out. And at the same time, I've been thinking about the books that shaped me, not just as a writer, and as a woman, but as a person. The books that kind of stamped my soul and shaped my thinking and my view of the world. And a lot of them were books that I read in my early teens. So books like Little Women, books
Mhm.
like Anne of Green Gables. The first chapter book I ever read was The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And so it was really with my retellings of Little Women that I was looking at not just what they meant to me as a young girl, but how my thinking about them has changed. So they shaped me. But what's interesting is that as I've revisited some of these really formative novels, the way that I look at them and the feelings that I have about them has changed. And so their books are perfect, right? I'm not I sometimes say what I do is not retellings, they're reimaginings
Mhm.
because they're the stuff that got left out or
Yeah.
that what do I have to say about these archetypal characters or these situations now with the perspective that I have as an older woman?
What do you think it was about those books that shaped you? Like, is there kind of like a common thread if you sit and look at it in all of them that is very similar or the same? Like, when you think Little Women, especially as like teen girl version of you and like how you look at it now, like, what is the piece of that, the heart of that story that's imprinted on you, or The Wizard of Oz? Like,
Well,
what do
they're
you think it is?
actually different things about them really struck me. So,
Hmm.
to do Little Women, it was there were things in that book, in Louisa May Alcott's book, that never that went sort of totally over my head, like Meg's struggles as a young wife and mother, which are is in the second part of the book, Good Wives. I don't think I really paid attention to that growing up. When I think about Amy, who is such a spoiled brat and who likes her, what was interesting is you always get that story from the perspective of Joe, who is the star and narrator. And I wanted to go, what does it mean to be the youngest in a family where all the personalities and roles are so clearly defined? So I wanted to tell the parts that I sort of thought were that either I had glossed over or that I felt were left out. Part of that, of course, was romantic passion, which is something that Louisa only experienced tangentially, but has been an important part of my life. So that was part of the Little Women journey for me. For The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy Gale is a really ordinary little girl.
Hmm.
And when I was growing up, I felt alternately like a really ordinary little girl or like I was just weird. And I think the thing about Dorothy Gale is there's a certain extent to which she's the first great American heroine.
Yeah, she is.
I mean, she's thrown into a situation where that would defeat most princes on a quest, and she's armed with nothing but kindness and kick-ass shoes, and she somehow not only has the resilience to do what needs to be done, but she is a catalyst in others' lives for them to realize their dreams. So you take an ordinary person and you put them in extraordinary circumstances, and they can become extraordinary. And I think something that these books have in common is that they are women's stories. They are women's voices. They are about girls making choices.
Yeah.
And I think women's voices and choices, I don't want to get political here, but I think it's important to tell those stories. I think we need those stories.
Yeah, and I think it's something special that you're doing, like, with the fairy tale life of Dorothy Gale. Um, as I was reading through it, because I mean, D The Wizard of Oz was my favorite movie as a kid. My mom still
Okay.
laughs about me, like, skipping down the sidewalk, pretending like I'm Dorothy talking to, what's the
Lions and tigers
professor.
and bears. Oh
It's
my.
my favorite scene was whenever her and Toto meet the professor. I think professor out in the middle of
Professor
no.
Marvel.
She's like, yeah, see you later, Professor Marvel, and thanks a lot or something. She's like, you would just skip down the sidewalk and say that. Um,
Oh,
so I think like And like you said, it's like it's girl stories and it's about girls making choices. And it's like even as you get older, I think this book was just a reminder of like that girl's still always in you, like make the choice. Now you're like the older version of her, like make choices for that girl. Like do right by that little girl that's still there. I just think like
Thank
it's
you.
very special what
Yes.
you're doing. Yeah.
Well, that's totally it. I think that the other thing is that these are all coming of age stories, right? The Wizard of Oz, Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, which gets a big mention at the beginning of it's D. Gale's emergency reading book for the plane,
Mhm.
and it is in fact the next classic that I'm taking on.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
So but they're all coming of age novels. Now, one thing that has happened is that our coming of age is no longer in our teens.
Right.
We
Okay.
come of age in our 20s. And so because that's when we're expected to go out into the world and make good choices. Um, so I feel very comfortable aging up my heroines and when I send them out into the world and bring them into the modern day. And I
Yeah.
think that the pandemic complicated that for so
Mhm.
many, that ability to launch was compromised by the pandemic. And I started writing this book during the pandemic. And there was a point of time where I wanted magic. I mean, we've
Yeah.
been very serious about it's the woman's escape, it's the woman's journey, it's about, but honestly, there's a great sense of fun about the
Yeah.
book. And what I wanted is I wanted to go over the rainbow. I wanted to go anywhere, frankly. So we hit on the Wizard of Oz, and I thought, okay, Dorothy always goes to the Emerald City. So initially I thought she would go, little odd backstory. I thought she would go to Seattle, which is
Okay.
the nicknamed the Emerald City.
Yeah.
But it didn't feel different enough. It didn't feel magic enough. And Ireland, the Emerald Isle, of course, has its own aura of otherness and magic and wonder. And what I really wanted to recreate was that iconic 1939 movie moment when Dorothy lands with a thump in Munchkin Land and she's still in the gray environment of her aunt and uncle's farmhouse.
Mhm.
And I remember watching that movie on TV with my parents and we had a color TV. And that moment when she opens the door on the farmhouse and she's in Technicolor.
Yes. Yes.
And that's what I wanted to recreate. And it was because it was still we still couldn't travel. We were sort of on lockdown and then there were various restrictions and it really wasn't safe. So I didn't get to go to Ireland until the I was sort of at the line edit stage of the book. And I'd done a lot of research online. I Google mapped my way across Dublin. I was corresponding with a member of the English department in at Trinity College Dublin to get that part right. What I didn't know is that I would know it so well and so intimately that from the time our bus left the airport till we left, I had that same sense of wonder and of coming home. And I kept grabbing my husband's arm and going, honey, we're crossing the River Liffey. Or, look, there's the Grand Canal. Or, well, if we want to go to the arts school, we need to cross the road because that's the roof of the arts building. You know, as we're walking down the street towards the Trinity College campus. So it was a really magical visit, and I hope that Dublin setting is a strong part of the book that readers can kind of follow along and enjoy.
You've touched on a couple of things I wanted to ask you. So,
Okay.
reimagining versus retelling. I definitely think that is for sure what you're doing. How would you explain the difference between the two?
I have a lot of respect for fan fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I think fan fiction gets right is it sort of seizes on undeveloped moments and develops them. But I also think that when you're doing a reimagining as opposed to a retelling, you're not simply changing one element of the story. So it's The Wizard of Oz, but it's set in modern times, or it's The Wizard of Oz, but I've tweaked the backstory or changed the age of the characters. You actually need something to say,
Mhm.
which is an element of all good fiction. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and I know this sounds really um, a little more complicated than maybe it should, but I wanted to talk about the male gaze and writing
Okay.
your own story,
Mhm.
because it's not a spoiler to say that the thing that sends Dorothy Gale of the books, Dee Gale, who is in the graduate writing program at the University of Kansas, she falls in love with a professor in the program who is a best selling novelist. They have an affair, and without her knowledge or consent, he puts her in his book.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
And he defines her.
Mhm.
So he presents her to the world as Destiny Gale, this kind of creative vampire who seduces her older mentor and exploits his talent and fame uh, to write her own stories, but they're not original. This destroys her reputation, it destroys her self esteem, it breaks her heart. And that's the reason that she flees to Emerald Isle, to the Trinity College Dublin writing program.
Yeah. And she's very aware, like, people know about this.
Oh yeah, she's trolled. I mean,
Yeah.
she's it's he changes her name, but it doesn't take long, and he writes her in a very sordid way. So she and his book is optioned for a movie. So she really comes in for this storm of online criticism, and in the department her reputation is shot. Part of the reason is because she's put her own dissertation on hold to be the muse and domestic slave of this great man. And so that was, so she's under the practical it didn't help her cause any that she's 2 years behind in her program because she hasn't been writing, she's been taking care of him. So that's how the story starts. And one of the things I wanted to write about was the way she finds her own voice and learns to tell her own story.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts. I highlighted it. I think she's talking to Miss Maeve Ward, and she says, "That's why I'm here, to find my voice, to become new D." And you capitalized "new" and D, and I just love that. Yes, all I need is a fresh start.
And of course, what's funny is she needs a little bit more than a fresh start. I mean, she has the resilience, she's got the talent, she has, to borrow a line from The Wizard of Oz, the power inside her all along. But she needs to believe in herself and she needs to discover what she has to say. And all of the characters, or many of the female characters in that book, I'm dealing with different aspects of sort of being a woman and moving through the world,
Mhm.
from being harassed on the street to the casual academic misogyny, even at Trinity College. But I want you to see that the women have the power. I mean, the women in her mentors, Glenda Norton and Maeve Ward, who of course are the witches, um, have power. I think there are lots of mother figures in the book who have power, and so part of Dee finding her own power is learning to recognize the strengths of the women she encounters, and she makes a great female friend.
One of now this is, I feel like, a very simple line, but I really thought that it was just so powerful. I'm like, I feel like this is me. You wrote, "Maybe I was still telling myself stories to make me feel better." Can you talk about that?
I think told you that probably in the intro before we started recording, that my first stories were told to my younger cousins to bribe them to go to bed.
Yes.
And I've always told myself stories. And I think one of the powers that Dorothy has, because she has this rather difficult childhood with a famous artist mother who kept decamping and leaving Dee to kind of look out for her younger sister, or abandoning both of them with the aunt and uncle in Kansas while her artistic mother pursued her art. Dee survives by telling herself stories.
Mhm.
She makes things better by telling herself stories, and I think it's one of when I say she's an American heroine, some of it is she's making stuff up, but it's her
Mhm.
ability to make stuff up that gives her a certain optimism, a certain faith, the ability to survive in tough times. It's her belief in a brighter future. I think some of that at least used to be a part of the American character, and I think it's some of what we do as storytellers, or what I
Mhm.
have always done as a storyteller. I don't write books with miserable endings. I feel that if a reader gives me their money and the hours of their time that they have invested in my characters, that I want to at least leave them with hope.
Mhm.
So, big spoiler. There's this book does not end sadly. Um, and so I will say that growing up, the parts of my life that weren't great, I've always told myself it could be better.
Yeah, and that's why I love that line so much. I was like, I feel like this is, I mean, I can't speak for every woman, but I was like, this is something I think a lot of women have to do every day. Like you said, like you just have to tell yourself, like, I just have to make it through this workday. It's not always going to be like this. Things are going to get better. Like we're constantly telling ourselves stories, and it is kind of, I think, for survival, just to like get through the day.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that even though Dee questions herself, maybe this is all going to be better, or maybe I'm just making myself stories, telling myself stories to make myself feel better. And I do think what changes for Dee from the stories that she told her sister so that they both could survive to the stories she's able to tell herself at the end is that her vision improves. One of the reasons that she's able to be seduced and exploited by this older professor is she doesn't see clearly.
Right. Yes.
And by the end of the book, she is seeing things a lot more clearly. So she's still telling stories, but she's also living a life. And
She's so
so,
great. She's so great.
it's make good choices.
Yeah.
And I think that happy endings are great, but I think a wonderful thing is that you can take steps towards your happy ending. And I don't want to give away too much about the ending of the book, but it's not a happy ending, it's a great beginning.
Mm, yeah. Well, I feel like, well, all I always like, I read the book version of the book, of the story, probably like 2015, 2016. And for anyone that's listening, I mean, I grew up loving the movie, but reading the book is such a totally different experience. But I do always think of Dorothy, and I think of Judy Garland, and I think of the movie, and it's like, what happened to her what happened next, kind of thing. So with the way that this book ended, I was like, this is perfect. And just the fact
Oh,
that you
thank
gave it
you.
the way that you gave it to us, I was like, man, I've always wondered, what would Dorothy be doing now? So I think it's just really special. So like, had you always known you wanted to reimagine Dorothy's story, or like how did we get the book?
So I said we've been doing sort of these. I've been looking at these novels that formed me, and I did
Yeah.
Little Women, which is so iconic. I don't think there's a woman writer alive who hasn't at some point imagined she was Jo March.
Right.
Dorothy Gale, not so much. It was actually, and I know I keep nodding to him, but it was my husband who said, "Well, what about The Wizard of Oz? You loved those books growing up."
Shout out to
And
husband. Yes. Okay.
I was like I was like, "Honey, you can't write women's fiction about The Wizard of Oz. That's a really stupid idea." Because I'm not always as kind as he is. But the thing is it wouldn't let me go.
Yeah.
I
He
kept
planted the
going,
seed, and now you're
yeah,
like,
it was like,
"Wait, is it so
well,
stupid?" I don't know.
well, Okay, so when my boys were younger, I coached their Odyssey of the Mind teams. And I don't know if you or your listeners know what Odyssey of the Mind is, but basically it's a worldwide problem that's set for kids from elementary grades up through, I think, high school. And so the teams are divided by grade and they can choose different kinds of problems. But generally, they need to create both a narrative and a practical solution. So it could be, for example, take a light bulb, a 2x4, a purple balloon, make a convincing story about it, and create a car that moves. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but believe me, if you're coaching 10-year-olds and they have to do all the work themselves, you can point them to resources, but adults cannot. This is not like your standard school project. You really can't help. Writing, reimagining The Wizard of Oz was like that. It was like, okay, so I've got a girl and a dog and a scarecrow, and I'm going to do what? And it's like, here's my purple balloon. How am I going to fit this in? So, for example, with the character of Toto, I had to look at the dog and go, what does the dog do? Because I actually at one point was going, well, what are quarantine rules, getting pets to and from Kansas to Ireland? And then I'm like, why does the dog matter? Why is there a dog in The Wizard of Oz? It's someone smaller for Dorothy to take care of.
Yeah, yeah.
It's someone who makes her stronger. It's a catalyst for the action. There are no, I mean, here's a movie spoiler. Dorothy's about to get in the wizard's balloon when her dog darts off and changes the course of the story. So I'm going, what are the equivalents of that for my 25-year-old graduate student? Who's going to make us care about her? Who is she going to care about? Why does she feel responsible? And that's when you start to then dig in and you go, it's her little sister. It's her little sister Antonio. So when they were little, her sister called her Dodo, she called her sister Toto, and you make it work in that context. And it's full of that kind of, do I want to do it this way? Do I want to try it that way? I'm not a Athena sprung full blown from the head of the gods kind of writer. I'm a, how would this work? Do I like that kind of writer?
Touching back on the now that you are writing these amazing like women's fiction titles, do you think that and you touched on, I think you put it so beautifully earlier, like now you get to put in the things that you had to leave out. Did that take some learning and adjusting for you after writing romance for so long?
The thing that was the biggest struggle, quite honestly, was I shifted in the Little Women books from third person to first person
Mhm.
and from male point of view to all female point of view, which really required a level of intimacy and immediacy that I wasn't initially very comfortable with. I thought when I was writing my contemporary romance that I was pretty deeply in the skin. I wrote what they call deep third person point of view. So seen through the camera lens, through the filter of the feelings, emotions, experience, mindset of the characters. So you wouldn't think it would be that big a shift to write in first person. You'd think it would just be a matter of pronouns, but it wasn't. Writing in first person with that kind of I am in your head and I can't get out was a learning curve. And I really like it because I feel that it let me tap a level of emotion that I hadn't tapped before. And I enjoyed that. I think that the things I always wanted to write about were there, but certainly I couldn't have developed the level of female friendship between, say, Riti and Dee if I were writing romance. Not that friendship isn't an important component of women's lives, but you just have, if you have 90,000 words and you're completely focused on the arc of the relationship and the arc of two separate characters equally, then you don't have a lot of time to develop secondary characters. And in, for example, the fairy tale life of Dorothy Gale, there's Dorothy, who owns the story. It's her story. It's her journey, but you have other characters on the journey. You have the Tin Man, you have the Scarecrow, you have the Cowardly Lion, and they also need their arcs. And so balancing the competing needs of those was a new problem to solve with this book, but it was great fun. And it also was really fun to be able to write male point of view again.
What's fun for you about putting out these like, I think if you have not seen or read The Wizard of Oz, I hope like part of the fun of experiencing these books is like going back now and watching it and reading the book. The book is so different from the movie. It's so good. But like for you, like fun wise, I think if you had to narrow it down to like one thing, what is your fun in doing the reimaginings?
Well, I love the Easter eggs. I
Yeah.
do. I did include, I know, as I said, I grew up, I read all 14 books. They were among, it was, I read them before I read Narnia, which is a classic I
Wow.
will
Okay.
never, never, never touch. Well, because my mother had her mother's copy, not of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, or not of the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but of Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz, maybe is the, I'm looking at it across my office, and I'd have to go to peer and see whether it's in Oz or of Oz. But she has this book that was given to a great great uncle in 1909 for by Aunt Hildy at Christmas time. And as I was, when she couldn't take me to the library, I would go poke in my family bookshelves. And I found this book and it had pictures. And I thought, I can read a book that has pictures because I'm 7. And I read it. And then once I read that one, I had to go to the library and read the other 13 Oz books. Then I am of the generation that watched The Wizard of Oz on TV. I won't say for all of the 30 years that it was broadcast on CBS, but it used to be, we didn't have a choice of movies or a choice of channels or cable or any of that. If CBS broadcast The Wizard of Oz at the holidays, by golly, the family sat down and watched The Wizard of Oz at the holidays. And I can distinctly remember the witch coming on and running into the kitchen so I wouldn't have to watch when she's going, Auntie M, Auntie M, I'm here, and then the globe glows green and it's Auntie M. Oh, it was terrifying. I always ran into the kitchen for that part. But I'm sorry, I totally have digressed here.
No,
What
my
was it?
favorite part is like when the house falls on the witch and the legs disappear. I don't know why. That's like
I
one of
mean,
my
it's so
favorite.
cool, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I said, so yes, there's so much fun in including nods. So I included nods to the book, and I did really go to the book for those archetypal moments. But I also included the movie, and I included references to Wicked as well.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I had to include references to Wicked because the song For Good was on autoplay the entire time I was writing this book, because so much of it is about the people who come into our lives, the found family that changes us.
Well, I love the title of the book. I love that it's the fairy tale life of Dorothy Gale. Like I've been thinking a lot about stories like hers and so many other stories and how like we've talked reimaginings. You hear in romance specifically people use the word retelling a lot, and I was chatting with a fellow podcaster some months ago and I was like, do you think what we consider fairy tales is like not necessarily changing but expanding? Like is it becoming even bigger? And I would say I feel like Dorothy's story is a fairy tale. So I wanted to ask you about the title, and if that was all on you, if that's something you came up with your editor. But when because I saw on your website you loved fairy tales too. So is that something do you think what we consider fairy tales now are changing? Would you consider Dorothy's story, because it is timeless, right?
I love you, and I'm so glad you brought this up. And now I feel like a total fraud because I actually stole that from L. Frank Baum.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, I want you to think I'm like this. Okay, I'm walking around my office, clutching the microphone, so I can reach my copy of The Wizard of Oz and
Okay.
read to you from the front of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is also in the front of The Fairy Tale Life of Dorothy Gale. This is from the intro written in 1900. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to please children of today. It aspires to being a modernized fairy tale in which the wonderment and joy are retained and the heartaches and nightmares are left out.
I love that. And I love the next one you put. Witches can be right.
Well, one of my favorite lines in the book, which is not a spoiler because it's going on a little social media card on as soon as we get finished recording this podcast, is from Maeve Ward, which
Mhm.
is women who tell the truth have always been called witches.
Yeah. I love Maeve. She's tough, but I love Maeve.
She was, when you ask me about fun, and I say, okay, I was really drawing on the books that have come before, the reimaginings that have come before. I mean, there's she doesn't look like the witch in the book. She looks like the witch in the movie, and her sentiment was part of my feelings about her were definitely inspired by the musical Wicked.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I
I
love
just tried to, it's because it's fun,
it's
right?
fun, yeah. Have fun
That's
with it.
that's and I hope readers do. I do think that there's enough in there about Dee's journey itself that you don't necessarily have to be familiar with either the book or the movie, but I think if you are, then it's like a Where's Waldo book. It's like, "Oh, I see that. I know that. That's a reference to the green spectacles. That's a reference." I mean, whatever it is that floats your boat, and however big an Oz geek you are, I hope you can dig in.
So, what is next for you? Like, what are you working on now? Or what can we expect next from you?
Well, I did mention that, in fact, at the beginning of the fairy tale life of Dorothy Gale, when she's going down to the hotel bar on her first night, she makes a reference to her emergency book for the plane,
The Anne of Green Gables, that's right.
which
Yep.
is Anne of Green Gables. And I really thought I would be doing a Shakespeare retelling next, but I couldn't quite let go of that Anne of Green Gables thing. Everyone wants to be that passionate, plucky orphan, imaginative orphan Anne. Now, one thing I did do, of course, is I've then gone from American heroines to North American heroines, since Anne is definitively Canadian, and in my book she will not be, um, which I hope will not earn me the enmity of the millions of Anne fans out there. But I think Anne is interesting because, again, I say you look for, wait, what do I have to say? What's my way into the story? And you picked up on this beautifully and set it up great at the beginning of this interview when you said, these are the stories we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better. In the world of My Little Women, of the March Sisters duology, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women does not exist. So my March Sisters are the March Sisters.
The March Sisters.
In the fairy tale life of Dorothy Gale, L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz was never written, and there is no 1939 movie. Dorothy Gale Dee Gale is the Dorothy Gale of that universe. But now I'm thinking about stories, and what are the stories we tell ourselves, and how are they useful, and when are they useful, and when do we have to let them go and do something else? And that's really a place where I was interested in going. And so I am currently writing, and the working title is Anne of a Different Island, about a young woman who grows up on Mackinac Island, Michigan, which is an isolated island with horse drawn carriages. And so, even though she has two loving parents, she imagines herself as Anne of Green Gables. Anne of Green Gables is her role model. And so she tries to be she aspires to be Anne of Green Gables, and then the story will come in as she sees how love and life maybe aren't what she thought they were from books.
Yeah. Oh, that's
So
all
both
it's amazing.
how they help her live, and where it's time to let them go and live her own story.
Well, my last question I have for you,
Mhm.
knowing what you know now, what would you go back and tell Virginia at the beginning of her writing journey, her writing career?
Be kind to yourself and be kind to others. This is a long road.
Over 30 books.
Yeah.
And then you will
Yeah.
have over 30 books.
I mean, well, I think you can writing is such an isolating business that it's absolutely wonderful when you can connect with people. So, whether you're connecting with other aspiring writers, whether you're connecting with fellow readers at book clubs or through a podcast like this one, thank you so much. Um, we write because we're really seeking connection. And so as you're writing, remember that. Remember that you're you're you want to access your own heart and be authentic there, and be open to other people and their thoughts and their hearts, and don't isolate yourself. If you have an opportunity to give somebody a hand, do it. If you have the courage to reach out to a model or an idol, write a fan letter, leave a review, do it. Yeah, don't isolate yourself. Cherish your connections. They'll be with you a long time.
Well, can you share with us where everyone can keep up with you online?
Of course, virginiacantor.com is, the place, but I'm very active on Facebook and Instagram. So Virginia Cantor Books and at Virginia Cantra.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Virginia. This was amazing. Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful book. I've already read my copy. Thank you to the publisher. But I've also already pre ordered the audiobook because I'm like, I need to listen to this. So,
Oh, can I just give a plug for the audiobook?
yes, please.
Because they did an amazing job casting. I mean, I've had the privilege of having more than one actor lend their talents to narration before, but not only is the character of Dee amazing, the producer got a British actor who actually I think was in one of the Harry Potter movies to
Oh
read
my gosh.
Tim,
Yeah.
and got we auditioned a couple of Irish actors, and Sam is spot on. So I have 3 narrators, they're all brilliant, and the audiobook is a treat.
I can't wait. Well, thank you, Virginia.
Bree, this has been a delight. Thank you so much.